The silent survivalist. A child who learned that being unseen was the only way to stay safe. At the deepest level, the ignored child grows up believing that visibility is dangerous and invisibility is survival. What once protected them, silence, self-sufficiency, emotional restraint, slowly becomes the architecture of loneliness in adulthood. There is a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being unseen. Not hated, not abused in obvious ways, just overlooked. You grow up in a house where life moves around you, but rarely toward you. Your achievements are acknowledged briefly. Your pain is inconvenient. Your voice? Optional. And slowly, quietly, something inside you adapts. You stop asking for attention. You stop expecting comfort. You stop believing that your emotions deserve space. You become easy. The quiet child, the independent one, the one who never causes trouble. Adults praise this. Teachers admire it. Relatives call you mature for your age. But what they're really seeing is survival. Because when a child learns that their presence doesn't change anything, they begin to erase themselves. And here lies the paradox. The very strategy that once protected you, being quiet, self-sufficient, emotionally contained, is the same strategy that begins to isolate you as an adult. You become someone who doesn't ask for help, someone who struggles to express needs, someone who feels strangely invisible in relationships. Not because people dislike you, but because you were trained to disappear. The ignored child doesn't grow up loud and angry. They grow up silent. And silence, over time, becomes identity. Psychologists call this experience emotional neglect. And unlike physical abuse, emotional neglect is defined not by what happens to the child, but by what never happens at all. No emotional attunement, no curiosity about the child's inner world, no consistent validation of their feelings. The child's emotional reality is simply unattended. Imagine a plant placed in a room without sunlight. No one harms it directly, but slowly, quietly, it begins to wither. This kind of childhood creates several powerful psychological adaptations. Emotional neglect teaches the nervous system a simple rule: your feelings are not important. Over time, children stop trying to express them. Neuroscientifically, this can affect the default mode network, the brain system responsible for self-reflection and identity. When a child's inner experiences are consistently ignored, they struggle to form a stable sense of self. Not because they lack depth, but because their inner world was never mirrored back to them. Ignored children often become hyper-independent. They learn early that relying on others leads to disappointment. So they stop relying on anyone. They solve problems alone, process emotions alone, carry burdens alone. On the surface, this looks like strength. But underneath, it is a survival adaptation. Because independence was not chosen, it was required. Many ignored children develop what psychologists call avoidant attachment. This means closeness feels uncomfortable, not because they don't crave it, but because intimacy awakens something dangerous, the memory of being emotionally invisible. So they protect themselves by keeping distance. They downplay their needs. They withdraw during conflict. They convince themselves they don't need anyone. But deep down, the longing remains. Carl Jung once wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. But sometimes the burden is even quieter. It is growing up in a house where your emotional life simply didn't matter." The deepest wound of the ignored child is not rejection, it is insignificance. The subtle belief that My presence doesn't change anything. And this belief quietly shapes a life. You become the person who doesn't interrupt, the one who listens more than they speak, the one who gives space but rarely takes it. You become good at shrinking, and over time, this shrinking becomes invisible grief, because the ignored child learns a devastating trade: authenticity in exchange for acceptance. You learn to adapt to other people's needs. You learn to be easy. You learn to be low maintenance. But every time you suppress a feeling, every time you silence a need, a small piece of you goes unheard. The philosopher Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote, "The only sadnesses that are dangerous are the ones we carry silently." And the ignored child becomes an expert at carrying silence. Silence about loneliness, silence about resentment, silence about the quiet question that follows them into adulthood. If I disappeared, would anyone really notice? This question rarely becomes conscious, but it shapes behavior in subtle ways. It creates people who overfunction, people who accommodate, people who make themselves useful instead of visible, because usefulness feels safer than vulnerability. And yet, the cost is enormous. You can be surrounded by people and still feel strangely alone, not because you lack connection, but because the real you was trained to stay hidden. When ignored children grow up, the patterns don't disappear.
They simply evolve. The silent survival strategies of childhood begin shaping adult life, and you might recognize some of these patterns. Difficulty expressing needs. You might struggle to ask for help, even when overwhelmed, even when exhausted, because somewhere deep inside, a belief whispers, "No one will show up anyway." So you carry everything alone. Feeling invisible in relationships. You might find yourself in friendships or romantic relationships where you feel overlooked, not intentionally ignored, just not fully seen. And strangely, this dynamic feels familiar because it mirrors the emotional environment you grew up in. The nervous system tends to recreate what it recognizes, even when it hurts. Over-accommodating others. Ignored children often become incredibly empathetic adults. They notice subtle emotional shifts. They anticipate people's needs. They give space. They listen deeply. But sometimes they give so much attention to others that they forget to exist inside the relationship. Fear of being too much. Expressing anger feels dangerous. Expressing sadness feels uncomfortable. Expressing needs feels selfish. So emotions get filtered, edited, reduced. You become emotionally palatable, but authenticity requires space, and the ignored child was never given much of it. Hyper-independence that feels like isolation. You might pride yourself on not needing anyone, handling everything alone. But independence becomes a prison when it prevents intimacy. True connection requires allowing others to see your vulnerability, and that can feel terrifying. A quiet identity confusion. Many ignored children grow into adults who struggle with a subtle question: who am I really? Because identity forms through reflection, through caregivers responding to your emotions, interests, fears, and dreams. Without that mirroring, the self forms in fragments. So adulthood becomes a slow process of discovery, not creating a self, but uncovering the one that was never fully allowed to emerge. Healing the ignored child does not mean blaming your parents. Many caregivers neglect emotionally, not out of cruelty, but out of their own unhealed wounds. They were never taught how to see emotional worlds.
But understanding the origin does not mean accepting the outcome. because your emotional life deserves space now. Healing begins with something radical: reclaiming your visibility. This can look like 1. Inner child work. Start listening to the feelings you once suppressed. Ask yourself simple questions. What do I need right now? What emotion am I avoiding? The ignored child heals when their voice finally becomes heard. 2. Learning to express needs. At first, this feels uncomfortable, even unnatural. But needs are not weaknesses. They are signals of humanity. 3. Nervous system regulation. Practices like breathwork, mindfulness, and slow body awareness can teach the nervous system something new: that being present is safe, that emotions can exist without rejection. 4. Shadow work. Carl Jung believed the parts of ourselves we suppress become the shadow. For the ignored child, the shadow often contains anger, desire, creativity, authenticity. Reclaiming these parts is not selfish. It is integration. 5. Choosing relationships that see you. One of the most powerful healing experiences is simple: being around people who genuinely notice you, who ask questions, who listen, who care about your inner world. This can feel unfamiliar at first, but unfamiliar does not mean wrong. Sometimes it means growth. There is a beautiful quote by Anais Nin: "And the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom." The ignored child survives by staying small, but healing begins when you slowly allow yourself to expand, to speak, to need, to take emotional space. Not loudly, not dramatically, just honestly. Because the goal of healing is not to erase the child you were. It is to finally give them what they were missing: attention, compassion, and permission to exist fully. The goal is not to be fixed, but to become whole. If this video resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe for more deep dives into psychology, human behavior, and the hidden patterns shaping our lives.